friend, just like me, moved from France to the Netherlands, and he's now at the Delft Haptics Lab, where they do all kinds of things about the perception of feeling. They even saw robots together with the humans. So So, for yours.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. It's a very pleasure to be among physicists. So usually I'm amongst the roboticists, and so it's a nice change of pace, especially because I think we have some cool physics going on in our tactile interface. So today, what I want to talk about is our work toward trying to tackle one of the biggest challenges in robotics, which is today still grasping and manipulating objects. So it seems like something which is very easy to do, but for robots, it's still like mostly impossible, except in few cases. And so the way we've been doing it is through looking at how humans manipulate and how humans perceive friction and perceive contact. And so one of the reasons we are doing this is that most of, I mean, maybe you know that the project, I would say, but one of the main, so if you think about grasping in robotics application or even pick and place, most of what should comes into your mind is the science fiction where it's in the kitchen, it's actually grabbing object and then manipulating. But the reality is that right now robots are just in factories with very specific parts that are coming exactly at the same position, at the right speed, and then we have a pick and place, which is just a suction cup. Everything is designed to work with a very specific structure environment. But then there's many challenges, especially like if we want to have robotics in agriculture, for grasping objects which are unknown and kind of an unstructured environment as well, where you might have plants, but also like that bell paper might have a different shape each time. It's not going to be exactly the same thing. Your vision system can see the shape, but there's a lot of noise as well that might impair what you think you know, or what the controller thinks it knows. And on top of this, most of the problem is that the surface itself might be more slippery or more grippy than what you expect, and you might drop the object really quickly. So the solution so far has been to use these adaptive grippers, which are deformable grippers. So that use mechanical compliance essentially to cage the object around and make a tight grasp essentially. But if you think about doing things which are a little bit more than just grasping, but starting to manipulate, so if you take a pen in your hand and then start to manipulate it, what you realize really quickly is that we don't cage objects if we want to manipulate them. What we do is we pinch them, we have what's called precision grasp, and we can roll, we can slide, we can control friction. So our goal is really to understand how we can control friction, not just grasping itself. And yeah, so the main introduction is to say, well, grasping is a very enduring problem, but we have to recognize that these tasks are like trivial for all of us, even at 5 years old. So even if my son is just like grabbing some objects, playing with it, stacking them, manipulating them, it's very normal for every one of us to do it, and yet it's a phenomenal undertaking, very difficult to do. Yes. So it takes about 2 years, right? 2 to 3 years. So my kid is 4 years old, but it's true. Initially, it's very difficult. So we learn how to. Yeah. So there's some neural network going on and some training of neural network for sure. But what happened is, and I'll show you more about this, is that what I think is the big problem, and robotics has been tackling it from the kinematics point of view. So how to put the finger at the right place, how to control that. But the sensing itself is mostly done by vision, except few exceptions. But what we think is that we need tactile sensing. We need to understand what's going on at the interface to do it. And so I'm not the only one to think about those things, especially like the lab of Leroy in Bristol is probably doing what I think is the best work on this topic. And what they do, the video is not starting. Yes. So what they do is that they have those tactile sensors here, some students in the back. But it's a tactile sensor, they're increasing the load, and they're looking at these tactile sensing points. And then when the load starts to slide, you can see like some initial sliding. And then what happens is that they react. So they see the object slipping, poof, they react, and they act at it. They act once it's done. But if you think about how humans work, it's actually not, they are not reacting to slippage. They are actually predicting slippage, and they're anticipating as much as they can if it's going to slip. So they never really let the object go. So this is quite old paper, but very seminal in the field of neuroscience and neuroscience of grip, which is from Johansson. And what they asked is just to lift an object, and that object has force sensor, displacement sensor, all the good stuff. But also they had this little pad where you could change the texture of the object. So they could have silk, sweet, or sandpaper, so different friction level, and they measure all of this. And so what you see is that initially the person grips, but there is no load force, so there's no force tangential direction. And then of course they're lifting up, and they will hold that weight. And what's interesting is that when you look at the grip force in the steady states, you have different levels of grip force. So humans apply a level of friction, a level of grip force, which compensates friction essentially. So if it's sandpaper, we will release our grasp and be with a very low force. But if it's something like silk, which is very slippery, we will increase more force. And actually
Yeah, I was going to.
Yeah.
Will collapse if you.
Yeah. So so actually, what we know is that we set ourselves around at a safety margin of 20%, right? So we're putting ourselves, I mean, all of us are having like 20% margin of error with respect to when it's going to slip. And so that margin can change, of course. If the object is weirdly shaped, we're probably going to go at 50%. If the friction is low, it's also going to change. So people adapt, and especially our priors are going to change it. But when we looked at it with my postdoc, so she was a PhD student at the time, but when we looked at it and we discussed it also with a collaborator, one of the Johansson students, by the way, and we looked at this part of the graph, right? So if you zoom in, it's an old paper, so of course it might be, it's not very good resolution, but what you see is that the rate of change here, so the change of the rate of grip force is actually changing before there is even any lateral force. So we are not friction, we are not force sensors because we can detect friction from the initial time that we're touching the object. So, and you can do the experiment yourself. Like if you touch a slippery object such as glass, you don't need any lateral movement to actually feel that it's going to be slippery. And so at that time, we were very puzzled, like, how does that work? And can we figure it out a way to capture it? Yeah, you have hypothesis?
So in this experiment, do people also see what they're grabbing?
So this one, no, they are blind. Yeah, are blind, but they are guided, if I recall correctly. But if you see it, you will just have priors as well. But your regulation, once you touch, is mostly tactile. All right, so there's this puzzle, right? So now there's this way that, and maybe you have some hypothesis, I'll let you think about it, and I will try to answer. Sorry, what is the time? Oh yeah, I'm missing an axis, that's right. Here it should be 4, it should be time, right? So this is about 100 milliseconds. Yeah, I'm sorry, it misses, it's gone from my side. Yeah, it's about 100 milliseconds, something like this, the initial contact. So it's really, I mean, it's quite short. The time. Yeah, I'll correct that later. So anyway, so for the introduction, mostly what we've seen is that, so robots right now, they react to slippage, but human actually predict slippage. And so they learn friction on the go while they're manipulating. And so the big question we were asking, and this is what I want to talk about, is I mean, how do humans do it? How do we are able to capture that slipperiness sensation from the touch? And especially as a roboticist, the big question is, can we use that phenomenon, that cue to actually give a sense of robotics? So I'll start with the first question. And of course, we've talked about force, and so it's all about proprioception somehow, the perception of force, seeing our finger as a sphere that measures forces. But in practice, it's more tactile perception as well, right? And it's more about how the deformation of the skin informs about this frictional information. I will show you another experiment by Johansson, which is really crazy as well. But what they ask is just this participant to, little match, very, very easy, 5 seconds. it takes. And then now we repeated the experiment, but this time with anesthesia. So the anesthesia is just the top layers of the skin. And now this task, which was, you've done it thousands of times, very trivial, but for her, with anesthetized finger, no tactile cues anymore, but perfect motor control, perfect vision, she has a very hard time. She looks like, she's drunk a little bit too much. And it's very painful to watch, right? So it's very painful. It looks like a kid, a 2-year-old kid, trying to do this. Of course, she manages. So it's, but it takes like at least 5 times more to do this task. So it highlights very well, that everything that we do for precision grasp, for this delicate movement, is really driven by the tactile sensations. And so Laurence, who worked with me and mostly did all the work, so was very excited to try to understand, and we've been working with this hypothesis that we must have some cues in the deformation of the skin when we first touch the object. We must have some deformation, some pattern of deformation that informs us on the sense of slipperiness. And especially we have this friction modulation devices, which I will talk a little bit more after that, but we had it in the lab. And so she came along and then, play with it. And clearly with these devices, because we can modulate friction from really high glass to finger friction, which is about like 1 or 2 of coefficient of friction. So really high friction down to almost frictionless. And you could feel it. I mean, for us, we experimented and we had this. So she said, like, well, people can perceive it as well. It's not just a motor control problem. So maybe we can ask them if they feel, and then look at the skin at the same time. And to look at the skin, we first started to have like one illumination, which is so you guys do a lot of FTIR, I heard. So frustrated total internal reflection. In this case, we use frustrated reflection. So we have rays which are perfectly perpendicular to the surface, and we use the 4% reflection of glass to air. So when there is no skin, essentially the light bounces back to the mirror, to the beam splitter. And if there is skin, it's actually being absorbed and scattered, so it doesn't bounce back. And so it gives those images, which are very nice, very detailed of the contact. And of course, we said, like, well, it's great. We can measure contact now. And of course, we can also track the deformation of that pattern here. But we started the experiment, and when we put this friction modulation plate in place, what we realized is that the friction modulation actually pushes away the finger from the plate. So we couldn't see the image anymore. So we're a little bit puzzled. So we came up with another solution, which is adding another light for different color, which is very grazing. So maybe you've experienced that. So if you have a light which is very close to a surface, it will highlight all the topography. So we have this grazing light, which highlights all the different points on the skin, and so we can measure how the skin deforms by tracking some features, and we can measure it before it touches. So we have an image of the contact, and we have an image of the deformation of the body itself, of the fingertip. And of course, we had only one high-speed camera. So we did a kind of bit of clever optics in there to kind of split the image in 2 and then have one camera to do that. And then the last piece, so we had a force sensor as well, but the last piece on top is this friction modulation device. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, especially because it has cool physics. But on the way it works is that we use ultrasonic levitation, so ultrasonic waves in glass plates. So this is an example how that works. The G should run, but so when we turn on the ultrasonic, you can see the skin actually zooms across the plate, and when we turn it off, it goes back to the normal friction of the plate. So it goes back to about coefficient of friction of 1 to 2, depends. So we can really control everything in between. So the plates vibrates that way. It's not going to show. But what we show is that it's not just a perceptual phenomenon. So it feels like you're touching some bumps actually, but it's also like something that we can measure. So it's an actual change of friction force. So if we look at the friction force as a function of the vibration amplitude. So the more we increase the amplitude, the more the friction will go down. And we can make some measurements. It works with a normal human, and then it works also with certain materials. So we can make artificial fingers that are sensitive to that. So in this case, we measure just with the force sensor, like a 6-axis force sensor. And we
on the plate.
And we slide the finger in this case. Yeah. So we could no, actually in this case the plate was actually moving. Yeah. So we move the plate. So this is the first. So this isn't the same imaging technique. This is with the FTIR from the side of the plate. But you can see that one thing that we looked at is what happened when we increase the yellow is the amplitude. What we see is that the friction goes down, this is the blue, but you also see that the image gets dimmer, meaning that the object has less and less area of contact, real area of contact with the object. And at the time, so when I started working on this, nobody really understood how that would work. All the model in the literature was either giving negative friction coefficients or wouldn't work to explain a lot of the observed phenomena. And so I started to do a new model based on the Pearson theory of contact, right? So multi-scale. I've heard that some of you are familiar with this, but the idea is to say, well, the skin is randomly rough at different wavelength. So the more you zoom, the more you will see the same thing. And what happens is then when you have the pressure from the outside, it will distribute onto all those asperities and make junctions essentially. But when you start vibrating the object, you have squeeze film phenomena that will, so squeeze film lubrication that will occur, and you get an acoustic pressure on top of it, so radiation pressure that pushes those asperity away. And with this model, we could actually model it very simply. So if we take all the assumption and get it all the way to simplified, we can actually have like an equilibrium equation where we have the external pressure on one side, the reaction from the support, which is dependent on the gap between, the average gap between the plate and the topography of the skin. And then we also have this coefficient here, which represents the acoustic levitation pressure. And what we observe is that when we increase the amplitude of vibration, we actually levitate the skin and levitate slightly the skin away. And so by doing so, we will increase that gap, and so the skin literally floats above the plate. And of course, we can relate it to friction. So how does that work? Where essentially what we say is that we have an initial area of contact when there is no vibration, and we have some dependence. So the area of contact will be dependent also on the gap. So if you increase the gap with respect to the gap when it's void, you get a decrease of the area of contact. And we have also relative area of contact, which is like this, and it actually works pretty well to predict. And this is what we measure. So we said that the friction, the Bowden and Tabor friction is proportional to the lateral force that we measure. And this is what we have. So the brightness here is like the brightness of the image, so the real area of contact. And this is the friction force that we have. And we see a nice linear relationship. Of course, there is noise because of diffusion, because also of biology, which is very noisy in general. So it works very well. And of course, it predicts the friction pattern very well as well. Yeah.
It also depends on frequency.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's so we did more studies about this. There's yes and no. So there's a wide range of frequency that you can use. It actually works in audible. So we use ultrasonic for obvious reason. We don't want to have too much noise. Yeah. But it works in audible till, I don't know what is the high end actually. So it works in a wide range of frequency. But the force itself, the acoustic force the strength of it will change with the frequency essentially. And I'm not exactly sure how. That's a good question. So anyway, now we have this nice setup where we have the friction modulation device, all that objects in between, and then the camera. And so we're back to Laurent's problem where, how do we get that pattern of deformation? And so the first thing we did is look at how people press, and you see images which are like this. On the left, you see the contact area that develops, and on the right, this is for a high friction case. It's mass, but on the right, what you see is that there is some movement, but not so much. And now we do the same with the amplitude all the way up, and now we don't see much of contact area anymore. Of course, we have less friction, but here we see quite a large expansion of the skin. So we have this motion where the skin actually radially expands, and so we believe, like, you know, maybe this is the cue that people are using. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So we run what's called a psychophysics experiment. So very easy way to measure how humans perceive stuff. But the idea is always to ask for comparison between a reference stimulus. So this case was a high friction, and another stimulus, which is a comparison. So in this case, we run different amplitude of vibration, so different level of friction. And the way we interpret that is we ask people which of the two is the most slippery, so that way there is no bias, no cognitive bias about, you know, what is slippery. And this is the kind of graph we obtain, where here, for very low vibration amplitude, most of the people couldn't tell which one was which. So of course we randomize everything. So we couldn't tell if it was a reference or the comparison, so they always answer something. So we are about chance level. But when the amplitude was high enough, we could see that people, you know, most of the time, or like almost 100% of the time, could answer correctly, but they perceived the right friction. And of course, we could look at the images at the same time, and we see that all those points where people were actually very confused, we had very little lateral displacement. But when we were in the converse, like the lateral displacement, radial expansion, was actually pretty big each time. So we tried to analyze it a little bit further, and we looked at the divergence of that field, and especially like the average divergence of that field, to get a metric of, you know, how expanding it is. And we see patterns like this where, of course, for high friction, you will get a little bit of displacement, but not that much. And for low friction, you get a lot of expansion. And if you compare about, you know, the difference of divergence between the comparison and the reference stimulus, and the probability of answering, we find a correlation, which is quite weak, but nonetheless exists. And that clearly says that, you know, it's correlated. So we found somehow a pattern that would explain why we perceive that friction initially. Yeah.
So this divergence is like one order of magnitude larger than the amplitude that they're exposed to.
Yeah. In terms of deformation. Yeah. So it's the displacements are about, you know, sometimes 100 microns, something like this. So they're quite significant. So of course the vibration is few micrometer high. So from our perspective, it's almost nothing compared to that. The effect it has is just reducing friction. Yeah. It's also, you can't perceive it, right? So, I mean, if you look at it, or even if you touch without moving, it's very, very difficult to perceive. When you do, it's because, you know, you perceive the changes of friction, not the vibration itself. Yeah, and so the funny thing is that we try to get a little bit more modeling in action, and we looked at Hertz and contact, saying that, oh, you know, Hertz is like everyone uses that for spherical contact. So we looked into it. So actually, this is not an Hertz contact, because the first assumption of Hertz is to say, well, there is no lateral displacement of the body. So there's, I mean, it says it's frictionless, but the way I interpret it is more like an infinite fraction. So there's no lateral displacement. And so there is no lateral action, essentially. And everything in our case is about lateral movement. So we ran, so Laurence actually coded a finite difference time domain simulation that incorporates a frictional model, which is a Dahl model, which is quite known in control, but gives us a very nice elastoplastic behavior of the friction, which is continuously smooth. And lo and behold, when we had high friction, so when we set the parameter high friction, we see that the contact itself, instead of being quite normal, it actually has like a tangential component to it. But the displacement of each of the particles was actually pretty straight. And when we had low friction, so in that case, the lateral stresses at the interface, the lateral tractions were null, and we had like a nice Hertzian contact, which is parabolic. But then at the same time, here, all the particles are moving sideways. So this is what we observe. So we see like a strain in the tissue, but no lateral stress anymore. And we simulated the divergence, our calculation of the divergence. It looks like this. And for reference, this is what we measured. So we are pretty happy with the match, especially considering that skin is, quite a difficult, unreliable body. And so I think it would be better if we had a sphere of homogeneous material. Right. So this is the divergence of the displacement field. So it's it's a strain, right? It's a gradient of displacement, of deformation, essentially, of the displacement of those points. So this is deformation. Yeah. So we don't look at stresses. So actually, there's no. I'm not sure how we can measure stress at the interface. I know that you guys might have some solutions, but we look at the consequence of stress, which is really the displacement and the strain. So the cool thing with this plate as well, so with this vibration plate, is that we're not limited to turning it on and turning it off. We can actually also like turn it on while people are interacting with it. And so Jocelyn, who works for Peugeot, quite a well-known French brand of cars, started to say, well, I want that, and I want this technology in my cars. But the thing is, we couldn't do buttons, which is very fundamental. You need to click, and it needs to click back to you. And what we realized is that we have this expansion going on, and maybe we can use it to create buttons with it. And this is exactly what he did. And so what he did is that we ran a short experiment, same thing, psychophysics experiment. We asked people if he detected a click, and we started with a high friction, so the skin could expand. The stresses could accumulate, and then poof, you release the friction while you reach a certain force amplitude. And people responded very well as well. So for high frequency, they could detect all the time. And then he did the other way around, which is like he started with very low friction, and then at a certain threshold, he just like stopped the vibration, so high friction again. And in this case, some people managed, so 4 people out of 5 people actually. 5 people out of 14 could manage. Like a detection was very difficult to tell, but most of them were confused by the whole experiment, which means that going the other way around without having that stress that accumulates, you can't actually do this trick. And well, this is what we see, right? So increase in normal force, we change the friction, and what we observe in this set of images is the same. When when ready to trigger, it takes some time for the area of contact to actually levitate. So there's some dynamics here that takes some time to reduce the contact area, and it takes even more time for the skin to develop. So it takes about 20 milliseconds to go from stuck to an expanding finger, essentially. Yeah, so we're pretty happy with, there's a way now we can measure that expansion, and it gives us a very good idea on the coefficient of friction. And so now we're back to the original goal, which was, well, can we use that thing can we use that expansion to know the cone of friction? So if you think about robotics, what we're trying to do is exactly this: is you have an object and we're making contact at different points, and all we want is that the interaction at each of those points it lies within the cone of friction. So we want to know if the cone of friction is pretty wide, high friction, or is very small. Especially we want to know how far our interaction is, so that way we don't slip, or we do slip, but we control it as well. So this is a work from another student back when I was in France, and what she did is she used kind of what Lepora's lab was using as well, but one of the limit was we couldn't see the 3D movement, so we couldn't see the contact area. So she used a pretty neat system where she has 2 layers of marker on top of each other, and to measure the lateral displacement, but also the normal displacement. And so with these markers over there, you could track how the marker would move, but you could also track the change of colors, and the change of colors will give you an indication of how, how squeezed those 2 layers are. And that looks like this when you interact with nice moire patterns that occur. But if we look at one marker itself, what we see is that when we have interaction, we can look at the hue, so the color of this marker, and we can see some shifts. And with the shift, we can actually calibrate it to a normal displacement. And so she did this calibration, and during interaction, what you could see is that we could have those vector of deformation, so that trajectory of the deformation in 3D, and with quite a bit of data point as well. So we have a pretty dense measurement of that field, so not only on the lateral side, but also on the normal side. And she started with she started to calibrate her sensor, and this is, so she put some indenters on it, and I mean, she started by doing a calibration with hertz, with spherical bodies and hertz, and try to calibrate. And this is, so it works very well at tracking laterally, but this is what we obtained when we looked at the change of normal force. And in particular, if you just at that cross section, if we had a low friction, which is in red, we had some, some influence of the friction. It wasn't very pretty. But especially, it was very difficult for the same indentation to get the same shape of the object, depending if the friction was high. So there were a confound in the measurement we were doing between friction and the actual deformation. And so, machine learning solved everything. So we use CNNs to measure the shape. And so she used a training data set with high friction, low friction, and she used many measurements about it. So she made a huge database. And magic of machine learning, we went from very crappy image to something which was much clearer, much smoother. But second of all, which was independent of friction, so invariant of friction. So now we have shape. We can measure shape invariant of friction. And somehow, to me, it was a big deal, but to most of the people in robotics, they were like, yeah, sure, because it's been done before. It's something that's actually pretty easy to do. But it got us thinking is, with the CNN, we actually removed the dependence of friction, which means that we remove some of the information, but it might be a way to from the difference between the vanilla model and the CNN to actually recover friction, recover if it's a high or low friction from it. And in effect, if you look at just sphere pressing, you see those patterns as well. So you see those expansions. So the gradient is actually expanding also more for. The gradient is bigger for low friction surfaces or low friction interaction itself. So we went ahead and then built another CNN, but this time instead of trying to match the shape, we classified if it was high friction. So we decided 0.4 was high, and or low friction, or if there is no contact at all, right? So we tried to separate that, and she trained it on a lot of examples, and it worked pretty well. So we sent some. So we trained it only on spherical bodies, on spheres of different sizes and different friction as well, and it managed to generalize to different objects like this cross here. So of course it doesn't work so well. There's still some smidge. But overall, it tells you wow, this is pretty safe to grasp, and this is pretty not safe to grasp. It's likely to slip from your grasp here. But the more crazy stuff is that now we also trying, so without retraining, is that we try with objects with separating one half with high friction and the other half with, we put oil on it, so with low friction here, and without retraining at all, it could manage to separate, to map where the friction was high and where the friction is not high, which is very beneficial. So we can make those maps where we have the shape of the objects and where is it Like we should grasp more. So if we have to touch this object, maybe we reconfigure slightly the finger and then press harder where we know we have grip, where we know we can hold that object without too much force and without too much fear of losing it from grasp. All right, and so this is pretty much all we've done so far. Of course, now the big issue is that we're trying to put it into an actual gripper and do the control with it. So this is something that is ongoing. But I want to conclude with this. So I think if you have to remember one thing is that there is, so Hertz in contact is wrong. Hertz was wrong. And so there is some lateral expansion that actually encodes or that actually affects the way a normal sphere on the plane evolves. So there is this, and especially I think what is remarkable is that humans have learned to use that to estimate friction, and so we can use this pattern to build and to use that and control robots with it. And so I think that's quite important. And so I think it's also a departure from what robotics is doing, in the sense that everyone is about vision, looking at the object, and we look at the contact. I think there's a lot to be learned at the contact level for robotics. And of course, our goal is now to use this to predict and to make manipulation a little bit easier. And so working on it quite hard, building a gripper now with those sensors. Yeah, I want to thank all the people, all the entities that sponsor, from the CNRS and INR, but also now with the 4TU in this soft robotic program that actually funded all this work, and all the team, and especially Invar Biesnek, a collaborator who worked on with us for all the neuroscience bits that you've been seeing. All right, so if you have any question, let me know. I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you very much. It was a very, very nice talk. Do we have questions? Yes, Paul.
Yeah.
I have a question about the finger experiment. You use the swap finger because we have all different kinds of fingers. Some are sweaty, some are less sweaty.
Yes. Yeah.
So how did you overcome it?
Well, so there is variability, and that's a fact. And the way to cope with it is just to have more people experiment. Yeah, and then we try to control as much as we can, try to control the angle, limit the. So we control as much as we can, but of course this is still a human who comes in. He's stressed, he starts to sweat, so there's still variability. And so instead of trying to limit it as much as possible, we just let people be as free as possible, but then having a lot of people. And so with enough data, we can find some averages. So this is why the psychophysics data are so noisy in a sense. But if you don't live with that noise, you live with too much constraining the human, and that creates over biases. So especially Invar, so he started the discussion, but Invar he is the neuroscientist guy. So he puts needle in people and he listens to the neurons, and I'm simplifying, but just neurophysiology, and which is literally that. Huh? and so he does that, but he needs to strap people in a chair. And so he has this robot and I give him some plates like this, and he has this robot that push down and then lift up, do a very neat motion, super, and he has a lot of variability still, less than us for sure, but he doesn't have any perception. People don't perceive anything. People are, you could do even lateral movement. So you could even move the plate sideways. People don't perceive it. And that's quite remarkable, right? So it means that if you're not active toward your goal, if you're not, touching something yourself, if you don't act upon your environment, you actually don't perceive anything. And I think that's a remarkable result as well. So he had like a negative experiment. We have like sort of, well, for us it worked. But I think the two combined are telling a much more interesting story in terms of how our brain works, in a sense that a lot of information is actually, so you live a little bit in the future. We're predicting how things will go, and we send a efferent copy, and so there is a prediction of how our skin will deform when we touch the object. And I think we're looking at the slight differences in lateral deformation. But if you think about this slight deformation, lateral deformation, compared to the actual compression of the pulp, it's almost nothing. So it's almost noise in the signal. And yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the great talk. I wonder with your last result, it's very, very cool that you can discern with this like half slippery, half sticky sphere with the machine learning. But what if you would run this FDTD model or something like that, like a heterogeneous interface? Could you also understand like the displacement pattern near this contact line?
Yeah, so this is what we tried. For sure, we tried not to go to machine learning initially. And I think when I joined the TU Delft, we were all like machine learning everywhere. And I think that's a great way to do it, in the sense that there will always be a case that is not modeled or pre-computed. There's always going to be an object that you've never seen before. And what's really remarkable with machine learning, it's not that difficult, right? It's just a CNN, so it's just convolutions of the image. It's just, so it's still like, algebra in some sense. But it can generalize, so it can map your environment, and it can extrapolate and interpolate inside that complex, multidimensional space. Whereas when we do our calibration, we already take, simplification on the case we have, so spherical bodies, and it will be true. It will interpolate perhaps well, but it will not take all the variable in consideration. So with this case, actually more generalizable than what we can do otherwise. But think of it as just a regression. It's just a fancy regression in this case, or classification in the sense that friction was classified, not regressed, but the shape was regressed. Yeah.
I have one question. It's more like maybe some, because not talking about the fight, but also I know I do now I love my child too. It's like when we want to check the viscosity, we just share it with our fingers. Has it been some work done on this?
Oh yeah. There's tons of work on viscosity perception. I think mostly from the force feedback people. So they use like robot to perceive virtual viscosity. So this is something we do, and it works. So depending on which viscosity you would use your proprioception, your muscle forces and displacements. But of course, like for sticky honey or something, which is or even water, you can think you will still like use tactile sensation. So there's a spectrum of sort of interaction that you have that goes from small, delicate, which are more tactile, more deformation of the skin, to more I would say like rigid body motion or lump parameters where it's all the body that actually interact with the. Yeah. So the skin is hugely viscoelastic. So you can press on your finger right now and then look at it. It has like multiple time of relaxation. There's fluid that moves in. It's super complicated. So that's why also we have such weird measurements. I mean, compared to what you guys have, our measurements is like full of noise everywhere. Mostly because the biological system is it's a stack of living tissues.
Yeah, because it's soft matter.
It is soft matter, yeah, sure. Yes.
Yeah, I want to know whether the finger padding affect this friction, or some of the finger with spring, some without.
Yeah. So we have another paper with Jocelyn where he has this same question, especially because he wanted to put in cars eventually, have touchscreens. And so of course you think about all the people, the older folks and the younger folks, and people have trouble with the skin, moist skin, and there is a huge variability again. So it's very difficult to predict. But what we found is that this ultrasonic levitation, there is only about 5% of the population who has no effect, which is still big actually. And mostly younger women who has very elastic skin. So the one who actually put cream, take care of their skin, they have more elastic, so less viscous behavior. And because of the elasticity, what happens is that when the plate vibrates, it gets stuck to the plate. And so there's never that time where there's a little bit of lag due to viscosity. And so there's no detachment initially. And so it creates some effect we might want to have with bumps and shapes don't work so well.
Okay. There was a comment from Nick. Nick, do you want to speak up? That will be the last question. Sorry, Nick, if you want to say
Yeah.
your comment, you can. Yeah.
I was saying I find it extremely interesting that you study how the fingers respond to friction, and I know me myself and quite a few people at the office, we are climbers, so friction on the fingers is extremely important. And I'm just saying that I would love to see experiments around this, perhaps where you see how the grip adapts and you manipulate this elasticity of the skin to get the maximum out of it.
Yeah. So climber was the second population of people who screw up our experiments. So, but so because so where I was in Marseille was in the Calanque, and we had a lot of people climbing all the time. So we had a lot of climber over there, and they have, you know, the skin gets tougher, and again, like, it loses its viscosity, so it gets more less compliant than younger women, although there's younger men as well, but so it gets less compliant, so it's much tougher, but still it loses its viscosity. I mean, this relative viscosity somehow. So it still come back to an elastic behavior. So I'm guessing this is more physiologic than something that we train, and maybe the more callous the finger, or the more callous the tissue, you know, the more dead cells you have, and so the less fluid you have to move around, and so the more elasticity you get from the dead cells and the less from the fluid. So yeah, I don't know exactly how that works, but it's certainly, I'm pretty sure someone studies it.
You can oil the rocks and then have the machine learning code predict when they fall.
Yeah, that would be great. And then climbing robots. That'd be cool.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's thank you, Michaël, again. See you have a good weekend, and if you want to show what you do to Michaël, then we will be visiting.